History often remembers innovation as something orderly, an elegant sequence of breakthroughs recorded, credited, and celebrated, but the evolution of sci-fi filmmaking has never followed such a clean trajectory. Beneath the official timelines lies a more complicated story, one shaped by overlooked creators, forgotten experiments, and techniques that first appeared in films too small, too strange, or too early to be embraced. These innovations flickered briefly on screen, disappeared into the margins, then resurfaced years later, reborn under different names, attached to studios that never acknowledged their origins. Across independent productions, short-lived cult films, and underfunded genre oddities, filmmakers devised solutions not because they sought acclaim, but because necessity forced their imagination into uncharted territory. They built camera rigs out of spare parts, engineered lighting systems from scavenged hardware, and blended analog and digital processes long before such hybrid experimentation was fashionable. Their films may not have made headlines, but their ideas quietly shaped the very language of modern sci-fi cinema. As decades passed, Hollywood reintroduced these techniques, sleeker, louder, wrapped in marketing campaigns that framed them as unprecedented achievements. Audiences celebrated the spectacle without ever knowing that echoes of these visuals had already existed in forgotten works that vanished from theaters before anyone understood their significance. Meanwhile, the original creators watched the industry embrace familiar patterns, often recognizing inspirations pulled from innovations they had abandoned, refined, or even doubted. Tonight's episode revisits those hidden blueprints. We step back into the shadowed corners of cinematic history, examining 15 films that pioneered methods later reclaimed by a system eager for novelty but indifferent to provenance. These are not the giants of the genre, nor the canonical milestones often highlighted in retrospectives. They are the quiet disruptors, the films that changed everything without receiving anything in return. This is the story of ideas that survived without their names. This is the archive of innovations that moved forward while their creators stayed behind. These are the uncredited architects of the future. 1. Dark City 1998. Though widely admired for its brooding atmosphere and philosophical undercurrent, Dark City's most significant innovation lies in how it visualized a world that reshapes itself in secret. To depict the city's nightly transformations, the effects team devised a hybrid process combining mechanical miniature deformation, practical morphing rigs, optical warping techniques, and selective digital interpolation. Instead of relying solely on CGI, which remained unstable at the time, they blended physical and digital elements to create transitions that felt simultaneously tangible and unreal. This approach produced a signature aesthetic: buildings elongated as if stretching awake, streets folded inward like living organisms, and the city's architecture rearranged itself in smooth but unsettling pulses. These sequences anticipated the reality-warping visuals that would later define major sci-fi and fantasy films, where entire cityscapes twisted, collapsed, or refolded through elaborate digital pipelines. Yet many of these later spectacles echoed the cadence and spatial logic first crafted in Dark City. Its innovations, however, went largely uncredited. While critics praised the film's artistry, few understood the complexity of its hybrid techniques. Production notes outlining deformation rigs and optical transitions were inconsistently archived, and some materials vanished during corporate restructuring. As blockbuster cinema embraced city-bending imagery, audiences celebrated the advancements without realizing that the template had been established years earlier by a film that never found mainstream financial success. For the artists who helped shape Dark City, watching its visual grammar reappear felt both inevitable and strangely dislocated, an acknowledgment of their influence without the recognition. In the grand architecture of cinematic reality manipulation, Dark City remains the overlooked foundation, the film that built the blueprint for shifting worlds, only to have the industry later reclaim the design under a different name. 2. Screamers 1995. Behind its bleak wastelands and mechanized terror, Screamers introduced a visual solution that redefined how films portray subterranean threats. Lacking advanced digital tools, the effects team developed an analog terrain behavior system by layering miniature soil plates with vibration passes and particulate bursts. These elements were composited into footage of barren landscapes, producing the illusion that something intelligent and deadly was tunneling beneath the ground with methodical intent. Instead of showing the creatures directly, the filmmakers let the environment speak for them. This indirect visual language became strikingly influential. Future sci-fi blockbusters would depict underground movement using digital waveforms, displacement maps, or animated ground warping. Yet their underlying logic, the pulsing concentric ripples, the subtle lifting of Earth, the debris patterns signaling direction mirrored the handcrafted techniques in Screamers. What appeared as cutting-edge digital artistry was, in many ways, a polished evolution of analog innovations created under extreme budgetary constraints. Because the film never reached mainstream status, few acknowledged its contributions. Critics focused on tonal bleakness, not technical ingenuity. Behind-the-scenes documents detailing vibration rigs and compositing patterns were misplaced as rights shifted between companies, leaving only scattered memories from crew members who later recognized their innovations reborn in far larger productions. These technicians described moments of déjà vu, watching blockbuster films employ environmental reactions identical to the ones they crafted through trial, error, and instinct. Yet no credit linked the digital successors to the analog origins. In the lineage of environmental effects, Screamers occupies a hidden but vital position, the film that taught future storytellers how to reveal danger through terrain itself, offering a blueprint that the industry quietly adopted without ever acknowledging where it began. 3 Strange Days, 1995. Beneath its raw intensity and unflinching view of a collapsing society, Strange Days concealed a breakthrough that would quietly shape decades of cinematic language. A first-person visual system designed to simulate the feeling of occupying someone else's consciousness. The filmmakers crafted a custom-built camera harness that hugged the operator's body, allowing the lens to follow the exact rhythms of breath, the sway of running footfalls, and the subtle tilts that accompany real human perception. This wasn't simply point of view, it was embodied vision, achieved through an optical assembly engineered specifically to replicate the sensory immersion of the film's fictional recording device. These sequences demanded physical precision. Operators sprinted through tight corridors, climbed structures, and navigated crowds in extended takes that seemed impossible for the technology of the mid-1990 seconds. The transitions into these sequences, shifts in framing, color, and motion were designed to mimic the moment of entering another mind. Years later, Hollywood blockbusters would unveil comparable first-person rigs and claim them as cutting-edge innovations. The similarities were unmistakable. The fluid distortions, the heightened peripheral awareness, the sensation of being inside the scene rather than observing it. But Strange Days arrived burdened by controversy and financial disappointment. Its technical achievements were overshadowed by its themes, and industry attention drifted elsewhere. Engineering diagrams for the rig circulated briefly, then disappeared. Early prototypes were lost during storage consolidation. Without these materials, its technical lineage faded, allowing future productions to reinvent ideas already mastered under far more difficult conditions. Even so, filmmakers familiar with immersive cinematography acknowledge its influence. Many describe watching later point-of-view-driven sequences and sensing a direct continuation of what Bigelow's team had pioneered. In the history of first-person filmmaking, Strange Days stands as a quiet origin point, one whose innovations echo loudly in modern cinema, even as its name remains absent from the official story. 4. Split Second, 1992. Beneath its grim, rain-slicked dystopia, Split Second hides a technical achievement that redefined how filmmakers approached atmospheric lighting. To create its signature look, neon halos shimmering across perpetual rainfall, the crew engineered a specialized water light diffusion system. High-pressure rigs produced fine, controlled rain curtains, which interacted with reflectors and neon sources placed strategically around the set. In camera, the droplets scattered and refracted these lights into shifting ribbons of color, giving the environment a pulsing, living quality that felt both synthetic and organic. This practical alchemy anticipated the neon-drenched futurism later celebrated in prestige sci-fi cinema. Decades after Split Second, filmmakers would deploy digital grading and volumetric rendering to craft glossy, futuristic cityscapes, claiming them as innovations of a new era. Yet their rain-saturated reflections, color-drenched fog, and chromatic halos mimic the exact visual behaviors produced practically in Split Second. It was a film whose look foretold a movement long before the technology existed to make that movement fashionable. Its contributions went largely unrecognized. The movie's modest box office performance and genre-blending tone prevented critics from investigating how its visuals were achieved. Internal schematics outlining the water-light interaction rigs were reportedly lost as the effects department disbanded, erasing crucial documentation of what had been an intricate and forward-thinking system. Still, its influence seeped outward. Lighting artists have spoken privately about Split Second as an early reference point, even when studio marketing credited entirely different inspirations. Watching the film today reveals not a relic of low-budget ambition, but an early blueprint for the neon futurist aesthetic now associated with much larger productions. In the grand timeline of sci-fi imagery, Split Second stands as an uncredited architect of a visual world others would later inherit and claim as their own. 5. Johnny Mnemonic, 1995. While its narrative may have been divisive, Johnny Mnemonic introduced a visual interpretation of cyberspace that quietly shaped the cinematic language of digital worlds. Because early CGI remained costly and unreliable, the effects team devised an analog-digital hybrid to simulate data streams, layered matte animations, fluctuating distortion plates, and synchronized lighting pulses were composited into undulating corridors of information that appeared to ripple around the protagonist. This handcrafted chaos evoked a sense of raw, unstable computation that many later films would refine through purely digital methods. As cyber thrillers gained popularity, studios unveiled updated versions of these visualizations, sleek tunnels of numerical energy, recursive data spirals, collapsing information grids, and marketed them as entirely novel. Yet frame-by-frame comparisons reveal unmistakable parallels to the imagery pioneered in Johnny Mnemonic: the oscillating wave patterns, the collapsing geometric fields, the illusion of three-dimensional data folding around the viewer's motion path. Because the film struggled critically, its innovations became easy to ignore. Press coverage focused on tonal inconsistencies and unconventional performances rather than the technical experimentation occurring beneath the surface. Internal notes detailing compositing workflows vanished during post-production restructures, and its analog groundwork was largely forgotten once digital effects matured. Multiple technicians later commented that they recognized the defect signatures and motion cues from their earlier work when watching newer films. But because the original methods were improvised, fragile, and inadequately documented, history simply absorbed them into a broader narrative of digital progress. Today, Johnny Mnemonic occupies an unusual place in the visual lineage of cyberspace. Not the most celebrated, nor the most polished, but the film that first carved the tunnel modern sci-fi would call its own without ever receiving acknowledgment for doing so. 6. Nemesis 1992. Among the wave of low-budget cyberpunk films that emerged in the early 1992s, Nemesis carried an unexpected technical legacy. A groundbreaking approach to capturing hyperkinetic action through a body-mounted camera system, unlike anything Hollywood was willing to acknowledge at the time. The filmmakers built their rig from lightweight plates, improvised stabilizers, and flexible harnesses that allowed the camera to stay anchored near an actor's center of gravity. Instead of presenting clean, detached movement, the lens responded directly to shifts in weight and speed, creating an unsettling, adrenaline-fueled perspective that felt fused to the performer's nervous system. Years later, major studios introduced polished versions of similar rigs, presenting them as state-of-the-art tools for immersive choreography. But the DNA of those systems, the lurching forward thrusts, the rolling momentums, the tight orbiting of the camera around the actor can be traced back to the analog experimentation performed in Nemesis. When cinematographers praised new ways of simulating a character's subjective momentum, many unknowingly referenced techniques born from this modest production. Recognition never followed. Nemesis lived in a shadowed corner of the genre, associated more with cult fandom than technical innovation. Few industry observers bothered to examine the film's behind-the-scenes ingenuity, and when the production company shifted hands, documentation of the kinetic rig was reportedly lost. Only the footage itself remained, quietly influencing the aesthetic evolution of action cinematography. Some crew members later described experiencing a jolt of familiarity when watching big-budget films praised for reinventing kinetic camera work. They recognized patterns of movement they had crafted through improvisation, injury, and instinct, now refined and sanitized by digital tools. In retrospect, Nemesis stands as an unacknowledged cornerstone of motion-driven cinematography, a film that tied the camera to the body before Hollywood realized how powerful that perspective could be. 7. Saturn III 1980. Though Saturn III is often remembered for its chaotic production and polarizing performances, its most surprising contribution lies in the creation of Hector, a robot brought to life through a remarkably complex multi-operator animatronic system. Instead of relying on a single performer or simple servo-driven limbs, the crew devised a coordinated control structure. One operator managed torso articulation, another directed limb movement, while a third handled micro-gestures like finger tension and subtle head pivots. This distributed performance gave Hector a disturbingly lifelike presence, as though its consciousness flickered beneath layers of mechanical logic. Years later, blockbuster productions would unveil advanced animatronic characters supported by digital cleanup and motion stabilization. These machines were celebrated for their realism, yet their behavior-hesitant starts, fractional pauses, fluid but segmented motions mirrored the patterns Hector exhibited long before. What the world saw as revolutionary robotics had, in essence, already been explored through analog means in Saturn III, though few made the connection. The film's reputation worked against it, critics dismissed it, audiences overlooked it, and studios had little incentive to revisit its behind-the-scenes breakthroughs. During ownership transitions, technical schematics detailing Hector's servo map and operator synchronization reportedly went missing. Without these documents, its influence became nearly impossible to verify in official channels. And yet its fingerprints remain. Animatronic designers have occasionally spoken about forgotten prototypes that anticipated later designs, and many describe Saturn III as an example of what could be achieved when creativity outpaced technology. Watching modern robot characters, those who worked on the film sometimes recognize familiar rhythms, echoes of a machine that once moved with unsettling intent. In the shadowed history of cinematic robotics, Saturn III stands as a quiet innovator, uncredited, overlooked, but undeniably ahead of its time. 8. Brainstorm 1983. Hidden beneath Brainstorm's high-concept narrative lies a visual technique that altered the course of immersive cinematography. To convey the experience of entering another person's consciousness, the filmmakers engineered a unique point-of-view system built from modified housings, experimental lens assemblies, and a lightweight stabilizing harness that clung closely to an operator's movements. This created a perspective that didn't simply follow a character, it inhabited them, shifting perspective with each breath, tilt, and stride. At a time when cameras were heavy and unwieldy, this fluidity bordered on unprecedented basis. The innovation extended beyond movement. The team experimented with varying aspect ratios and expanded color ranges during playback of the recorded experiences, creating a sensory contrast that felt larger, sharper, and more vivid than regular scenes. Later films would adopt similar techniques: fisheye exaggeration, wide-field distortion, perceptual shifts presented as next-generation solutions for immersive point of view. Yet the visual vocabulary they used echoed the foundational experiments of Brainstorm, refined by decades of technological advancement, but unmistakably rooted in what Trumbull's team had pioneered. The legacy became obscured partly due to tragedy and partly due to the film's uneven reception. Industry attention shifted away from its innovations, and technical documentation circulated only sparsely. Some early prototypes of the camera rig were reportedly lost, and without them, the film's contributions became harder to trace. Still, effects artists familiar with immersive cinematography can recognize the lineage. The way the camera glides as though tethered to a heartbeat, the sensory transformation during experience playback, the merging of human perception with mechanical motion, these patterns reappear across modern sci-fi. Brainstorm remains the forgotten backbone of point-of-view evolution, a film that built the future of first-person storytelling before the industry was ready to acknowledge it. 9. The Quiet Earth 1985. Beneath its stillness and haunting desolation, The Quiet Earth contains a technical breakthrough that has quietly shaped how cinema visualizes fractures in time. Lacking sophisticated digital tools, The filmmakers invented an analog method to simulate temporal displacement, an effect they called, internally, a layered time shadow. Instead of relying on optical tricks available in major studios, the team crafted multiple exposures at measured intervals, then merged them through meticulously aligned optical printing. The resulting imagery produced an unsettling sensation. Characters appeared to drift half a moment ahead of themselves, like echoes lagging behind the flow of reality. This analog illusion of temporal misalignment would later resurface in numerous high-profile sci-fi films, now realized with digital compositing and algorithmic frame interpolation. These later works treated the phenomenon as a new visual metaphor for time glitches or parallel selves collapsing, but they replicated the same ghost fringe signatures found in The Quiet Earth, the half-step movements, the faint duplication of form, the delayed convergence of motion. Very few acknowledged the precedent set by this unassuming New Zealand production. Its limited release ensured the technique stayed hidden. Many filmmakers never saw the film during its initial run, and even fewer understood how the effect had been achieved. Production logs describing exposure, spacing, and print alignment reportedly disappeared when the studio reorganized, and only fragments of interviews survived to describe the experimentation involved, yet the influence persists. Effects artists have privately noted that the film's analog methodology resembles, in principle, the temporal layering algorithms used today, an eerie parallel, suggesting that digital tools merely refined what was already discovered decades earlier. The Quiet Earth remains a cinematic anomaly, a small, quiet film that cracked open a visualization of disrupted time long before Hollywood claimed it as its own. 10. The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai. Across the Eighth Dimension, 1984, chaotic, genre-bending, and unapologetically strange, Buckaroo Banzai hides a surprising level of technical precision beneath its eccentric mythology. To portray dimensional crossings, the effects team devised a suite of analog distortions. Refractive plates bent light into unnatural curves, layered matte elements flickered at misaligned intervals, and optical streaks were manually shifted across frames to mimic spatial instability. These choices created the uncanny sensation of boundaries failing, of characters slipping through a plane of existence that resisted being filmed. What makes this especially notable is how closely later depictions of multiverse travel resemble these handcrafted experiments. When digital distortions became common in blockbuster cinema, their pulsing warps, frame offset jitters, and collapsing depth fields echoed the patterns first tested here. The methods differed computational versus analog, but the visual grammar was remarkably similar, yet few audiences and fewer studios recognized the connection. Part of the erasure stems from the film's cult positioning. Its offbeat tone overshadowed its technical accomplishments, and industry observers rarely studied its distortions as serious effects work. Internal notes that detailed the refractive setups and timing cycles were said to have been discarded as the production company downsized, leaving only surviving frames to hint at the sophistication behind the chaos. Effects veterans who worked on the film later spoke of a strange déjà vu, watching high-budget productions debut techniques that mirrored the dimensional ruptures they created using improvised equipment. Their innovations resurfaced, refined, digitized, and widely praised, while the source remained largely invisible. In hindsight, Buckaroo Banzai emerges not only as an eccentric cult artifact, but as one of the earliest architects of extra-dimensional visual language. Its distortions left a mark on cinematic history, even if its name was quietly removed from the blueprint. 11. Android 1982. On its surface, Android presents itself as a small, introspective film, but beneath its minimalist veneer lies a visual design strategy far ahead of its time. The filmmakers constructed an improvised lighting architecture built from neon tubing, reflective alloys, colored gels, and custom pulse controllers, resulting in an atmospheric palette that responded subtly to character. Motion. This handcrafted system produced visual rhythms reminiscent of what would later be known as the synthwave aesthetic. Though Android predates the movement by years, the lighting was not merely stylistic, it functioned as an expressive device, allowing the environment to mirror emotional tension. Slight fluctuations in color or intensity signaled internal conflict, creating a dialogue between character psychology and spatial illumination. Modern sci-fi productions would eventually adopt similar lighting behaviors through programmable LED grids and digital color grading. But Android achieved them through analog intuition and experimental rigging, assembled literally from hardware store parts. Despite its ingenuity, the film received little technical recognition. Its modest scale misled many into assuming the lighting choices were accidental rather than deliberate. Reviews focused on thematic elements rather than the remarkable optical experimentation happening on set. Production notes describing the reactive system were poorly preserved, and by the time synth-infused aesthetics surged in popularity, the film's contributions had already slipped from memory. Crew members later described experiencing uncanny familiarity when watching new sci-fi with expressive neon environments, recognizing patterns identical to those they had engineered decades earlier, yet no official lineage connected these modern interpretations back to Android. Today, the film stands as a quiet precursor to a visual movement often attributed to entirely different eras. Its innovations flicker beneath the surface of contemporary sci-fi, a reminder that history sometimes overlooks those who discovered the light before anyone else cared to see it. 12. Starchaser, The Legend of Orin, 1985. Long before hybrid animation became a celebrated fixture of major studios, Starchaser, The Legend of Orin attempted an experiment so unconventional that few recognized its implications. The filmmakers sought to merge cel-animated characters with early computer-generated environments not merely as backdrops, but as volumetric spaces that characters appeared to inhabit, rather than relying on emerging digital compositing tools. The team engineered a manual alignment system that tracked hand-drawn movement against polygonal geometry, matching perspective shifts and lighting cues with surprising precision. The digital models themselves were crude flat shading, minimal textures, irregular surfaces, but their function was visionary. They established rules for depth, camera drift, and environmental consistency that anticipated later animation workflows. Modern studios would eventually adopt similar hybrid methods, supported by layers of software automation, and promote them as major technical leaps. Yet the essential logic characters grounded inside digital space had already surfaced within Starchaser. Though almost no one noticed, its lack of recognition stemmed from a combination of timing and circumstance. Distributed unevenly and overshadowed by the success of larger animated productions, the film barely entered mainstream conversation. Many animators of the time remained unaware that such hybrid sequences had ever been attempted. Internal documents detailing the process circulated briefly, then disappeared. Some believe they were discarded when the animation house reorganized, while others suspect they were never formally archived at all. Decades later, when hybrid digital traditional animation became synonymous with prestige filmmaking, only a handful of specialists recalled that Starchaser had already mapped parts of that terrain. For members of the original team, watching these techniques reappear polished, celebrated, and uncredited produced a strange mixture of pride and erasure. In the history of animation, Starchaser occupies a ghost-like place, a pioneering step forward, unacknowledged by the very industry that ultimately built upon its foundations. 13. The Last Starfighter, 1984. Before digital imagery became synonymous with cinematic spectacle, The Last Starfighter embarked on a bold experiment, replacing traditional miniature spacecraft with fully computer-generated vehicles. The models were primitive, constructed from sparse polygonal meshes, and illuminated with early render algorithms that struggled to approximate real-world lighting. Yet beneath the rough surfaces lay a conceptual leap: the integration of mathematically driven movement, spline-based shaping, and digital camera paths that anticipated the foundations of modern CGI pipelines. Audiences and critics were unsure what to make of the results. Some found the imagery disorienting, others dismissed it as a novelty. Studios interpreted the mixed reception as a sign that digital rendering was too unstable for large-scale adoption. Ironically, many of the techniques born inside this film would later define blockbuster effects work now polished, accelerated, and heralded as revolutionary. The digital flight paths, for instance, reappeared in subsequent decades almost unchanged in structure. Though rebranded under proprietary toolsets belonging to much larger companies, the historical trail became even murkier, as promotional materials for later productions downplayed early digital efforts. Few public retrospectives acknowledged how pioneering The Last Starfighter truly was. Meanwhile, members of the original rendering team described moments of uneasy recognition while watching newer, films spotting mathematical quirks and movement signatures unmistakably similar to those they had composed long before the industry embraced CGI. Complicating the legacy is the partial loss of archival records, early render logs, algorithm notes, and prototype models reportedly vanished during storage consolidation, erasing documentation that could have substantiated the film's contributions. Today, The Last Starfighter stands as an early pulse of the digital future, a film that imagined computer-generated space before Hollywood was ready to accept it, only for its ideas to re-emerge years later under new ownership and new names. 14. Outland 1981. Though marketed as a grounded mining colony thriller, Outland quietly pursued a form of visual world-building that few recognized at the time. Its effects team constructed a miniature compositing workflow that blended particulate haze, refracted light patterns, and multipass mechanical movement into a cohesive environment that felt industrial, oppressive, and startlingly real. Instead of relying on traditional optical printers, the filmmakers experimented with partial matte layering and depth-weighted exposures, producing a sense of spatial density unmatched by many contemporaries. This approach would later become a hallmark of prestige sci-fi. The fusion of grime, atmosphere, and tactile machinery, presented as a novel kind of realism. But decades before it became fashionable, Outland had already established the vocabulary. Watch the drifting dust trails, the pressure-sealed corridors, the flicker of light across metallic structures. They anticipate the visual logic that later films claimed as fresh inventions. Yet because Outland performed modestly and lacked the spectacle of larger productions, its innovations attracted little attention. The film slipped into cult status, and with it, many of its technical notes faded from professional circulation. Some crew members recalled discovering unmistakable echoes of their earlier work in major studio releases, recognizing details so specific they could only have originated in the layered approach they once pioneered. Still, no public acknowledgement ever materialized. Internal documentation fared no better. Reports suggest that breakdowns of the film's compositing processes were misplaced during departmental transitions, leaving only fragmented testimonies and the surviving frames themselves as evidence of what had been achieved. In retrospect, Outland emerges as one of sci-fi's uncredited cornerstones, a film whose visual identity seeped quietly into the broader aesthetic of the genre, while its creators remained absent from the official narrative of innovation. 15. The Black Hole 1979. When The Black Hole entered production, it did so under the guise of a studio attempting to broaden its identity, not redefine visual effects. Yet the film's crew secretly developed a motion control apparatus far more flexible than anything typically found outside the most advanced effects houses of the era. Built from a patchwork of custom circuitry, precision rails, and experimental programming, the system allowed miniature passes to be layered with extraordinary accuracy. It created perspectives that bent inward, as if space folded around the lens rather than remaining static. The results carried an uncanny dimensional richness, foreground models drifting with ghost-like smoothness and backgrounds curving into impossible depths. These qualities would later appear in high-budget productions, whose marketing proudly framed similar multi-axis camera systems as groundbreaking. Few realized that the earlier film had already tested the fundamentals of these techniques, though without the acclaim or the infrastructure to promote them. Complicating the story is the disappearance of key technical documents. Operators who once handled the machine recalled returning years later, only to find their drafts missing and schematics untraceable. Some suspected the designs had been archived improperly, others speculated they had been discarded as irrelevant during organizational reshuffling. Whatever the case, when Hollywood reintroduced enhanced miniature capture systems in the 1990 seconds, the lineage appeared severed, as if the technology had materialized fully formed, and yet the resemblance remains undeniable. The smooth acceleration curves, the layered star fields, the gliding entrances into cavernous structures all echo the experiments of The Black Hole, a film whose innovations were overshadowed by tonal ambiguity and commercial uncertainty. It is a reminder that cinematic evolution often advances through forgotten corridors, with breakthroughs buried beneath the very industry they enabled. Bonus fact: Hardware 1990. Amid its abrasive industrial chaos and post-apocalyptic grit, hardware concealed a subtle yet forward-looking innovation, a method for making a robot appear as if it possessed an emergent, instinctive awareness. Lacking access to advanced animatronic systems, the filmmakers constructed a reactive behavior model using analog servo jitter, fluctuating light sequences, and carefully timed micro-edits. Instead of programming smooth, predictable movements, they leaned into irregularity, tiny hesitations, abrupt shifts in posture, and flickers of illumination that suggested a machine processing fragmented impulses rather than following scripted commands. This approach produced a distinctive illusion of mechanical cognition. Viewers were not shown what the robot was thinking. They felt it through the environment, the pulsing shadows, the oscillating glow across metal surfaces, the disjointed transitions that made the machine seem both sentient and unstable. Years later, big-budget productions would unveil digital behavioral systems for robotic characters, presenting them as major breakthroughs. Yet, the essential vocabulary, the stuttering transitions, the momentary pauses that imply decision-making, the jittery pre-movement signals had already appeared in hardware, albeit created through raw experimentation in a dimly lit workshop rather than computed algorithms. The film's cult reputation meant its achievements passed largely unnoticed. Early behind-the-scenes materials detailing the servo light synchronization reportedly disappeared during storage changes, leaving only the final footage to testify to what had been achieved. Technicians who worked on the production later described seeing robot performances in modern films that replicated almost exactly the behavioral patterns they once crafted through trial and improvisation. In retrospect, hardware feels less like a relic of low-budget filmmaking and more like an early attempt to depict machine intelligence as fractured, intuitive, and unsettling. Its innovations drifted forward into mainstream cinema without attribution, shaping how audiences perceive robotic awareness, even as the film that birthed the idea faded into obscurity. Viewed together, these films form a hidden constellation, faint points of light scattered across sci-fi history, each one carrying a quiet breakthrough that never found its rightful orbit. Their creators experimented in the shadows, working with salvaged equipment, improvised rigs, and fragile ideas that flickered briefly before vanishing into obscurity. Yet the innovations they forged did not disappear. They drifted forward, unmoored from their origins, eventually resurfacing in productions with grander budgets and louder acclaim. Across decades, the industry celebrated techniques it believed it had invented: distortions of space, new vocabularies of light, unfamiliar ways of moving a camera, strange anatomies of digital worlds. But beneath the polished veneer of progress lies a subtler truth. The foundations of these achievements were poured long before, in films too small to be noticed, by artists whose names never reached the spotlight. Revisiting these works feels like walking through an archive that was never meant to be opened. Frames once dismissed as experiments now appear prophetic. Effects born from necessity resemble the blueprints of modern spectacle, and the silence surrounding their creators speaks volumes about how easily innovation is separated from its source. What remains is a paradox. The future of sci-fi cinema was shaped in rooms where no one expected it, by people who rarely received recognition, documented credit, or even the comfort of knowing their ideas endured. Yet endure they did, absorbed into the cinematic bloodstream, transformed, rebranded, and carried forward by an industry that forgot where the pulse began. These films remind us that the path of innovation is rarely linear. It bends, loops, doubles back, and often disappears from view. But its traces linger. They wait for anyone willing to follow them into the dark corners of the past, where the uncredited architects of the future left their signatures in the flicker of forgotten frames.